Picture this. You're kneeling in prayer at Canterbury Cathedral in 1540, the morning light filtering through ancient stained glass windows as you whisper your devotions. But there's something wrong with the air, a strange metallic smell drifting from Archbishop Thomas Cranmer's private chambers that makes your stomach turn. What you don't know is that England's most holy man has been conducting secret rituals in those very rooms, rituals that would shock even the most hardened medieval mind. What you're about to discover isn't just another tale of clerical corruption. It's the buried truth about how Thomas Cranmer, the architect of the English Reformation and creator of the Book of Common Prayer, harbored appetites that went far beyond theological reform. Behind his scholarly exterior and religious authority lay practices so disturbing that they were hidden from history for centuries. Before we uncover this shocking secret about one of England's most influential religious leaders, make sure to subscribe to Buried Truths and hit that notification bell. We're about to reveal how the man who shaped Protestant England was secretly practicing rituals that would have horrified both Catholics and Protestants alike. Thomas Cranmer rose to power during one of the most turbulent periods in English religious history. Born in 1489 to a modest Nottinghamshire family, he seemed destined for a quiet life as a scholar and priest. His academic brilliance at Cambridge University caught the attention of King Henry VIII's court, where his support for the king's divorce from Catherine of Aragon launched him into the highest levels of church hierarchy. By 1533, Cranmer had been appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, making him the most powerful religious figure in England. He presided over Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn, oversaw the English church's break from Rome, and began the systematic transformation of English religious practice. To the outside world, he appeared to be a devoted reformer driven by genuine theological conviction. But Cranmer's private life told a very different story. Contemporary accounts buried for centuries in Vatican archives and private collections suggest that his interest in reform extended far beyond traditional Christianity into areas that medieval minds would have considered demonic. His study of ancient texts had led him to practices that combined Christian ritual with far more primitive and disturbing elements. The first signs of Cranmer's unusual appetites emerged during his time at Cambridge, where he had access to manuscripts that most scholars avoided. These texts, some dating back to pre-Christian Britain, described rituals involving the consumption of human flesh as a means of acquiring spiritual power. What began as academic curiosity gradually evolved into something much more dangerous. Cranmer's elevation to archbishop provided him with the perfect cover for his forbidden practices. Canterbury Cathedral's vast complex included numerous private chambers and underground spaces where he could conduct his experiments without fear of discovery. His position also gave him access to human remains from various sources, executed criminals, plague victims, and bodies donated to the church for proper burial. The rituals themselves were elaborate affairs that combined elements of Christian communion with far more primitive practices. Cranmer believed that consuming human flesh, particularly from individuals who had died violently or under dramatic circumstances, could transfer their spiritual essence to the consumer. He developed complex theories about how different types of human meat could provide different forms of enlightenment or power. His private journals, discovered in a sealed chamber of Lambeth Palace in the 19th century, provide disturbing details about these ceremonies. Cranmer wrote about carefully selecting his sacramental materials based on the spiritual qualities he believed they possessed. The flesh of executed heretics, he claimed, could provide insights into the nature of religious truth. The organs of plague victims might offer protection from disease. The hearts of executed nobles could transfer their courage and leadership abilities. The preparation of these materials followed ritualistic patterns that Cranmer had developed through years of experimentation. He established a secret kitchen in the depths of Canterbury Cathedral, equipped with specialized tools for butchering and preparing human remains. The chamber was decorated with religious symbols that combined Christian imagery with far older and more sinister designs. Cranmer's consumption rituals took place during the hours between midnight and dawn, when the cathedral was empty of other clergy and visitors. He would dress in specially modified vestments, traditional archbishop robes that had been altered with symbols and materials related to his forbidden practices. The ceremonies began with prayers that sounded like traditional Christian invocations, but contained subtle alterations that changed their meaning entirely. The actual consumption of human flesh was conducted with the same solemnity that Cranmer brought to traditional communion services. He would carefully portion out the prepared meat, often mixing it with wine or bread to create a grotesque parody of the Eucharist. Each piece was consumed, while reciting specific prayers designed to absorb the spiritual qualities he believed the flesh contained. But Cranmer's cannibalistic practices weren't limited to solitary rituals. He gradually recruited a small circle of trusted associates who shared his interest in these forbidden arts. These men, all respectable members of the Reformed English Church, would gather in secret to participate in group ceremonies that pushed the boundaries of human decency even further. The participants in these gatherings included some of the most powerful men in Tudor England. Sir Thomas Seymour, brother of Jane Seymour and uncle to the future Edward VI, was reportedly a regular attendee. Bishop Nicholas Ridley, who would later be burned at the stake for his Protestant beliefs, participated in rituals that involved consuming the flesh of Catholic martyrs. Even Thomas Cromwell, Henry VIII's chief minister, may have attended some of these gatherings before his own execution. The group developed increasingly sophisticated methods for acquiring their ritual materials. They established connections with executioners, plague doctors, and grave robbers who could provide fresh human remains on demand. The logistics of these operations were complex, requiring careful coordination to ensure that bodies could be transported and prepared without arousing suspicion. Cranmer's theological justification for these practices was as disturbing as the rituals themselves. He argued that Christ's commandment to take and eat had been misunderstood by traditional Christianity. The true meaning, according to Cranmer's twisted interpretation, was that Christians should literally consume human flesh to achieve spiritual communion with the divine. He claimed that the early church had practiced ritual cannibalism, but had hidden this truth from later generations. This heretical theology extended to Cranmer's understanding of martyrdom and sacrifice. He believed that consuming the flesh of individuals who had died for their beliefs could transfer their spiritual conviction to the consumer. This led to some of the most disturbing aspects of his practices, the systematic harvesting of meat from religious martyrs on both sides of the Catholic-Protestant divide. The financial aspects of Cranmer's cannibalistic activities were staggering. The specialized equipment, ritual materials, and payments to various suppliers consumed enormous resources. Church records from the period show mysterious expenditures on sacred vessels, ceremonial preparations, and payments to unnamed medical consultants who were almost certainly involved in the preparation of human remains. The psychological impact on Cranmer himself became increasingly obvious to those around him. Colleagues noticed that the Archbishop had developed unusual eating habits, often refusing traditional meals while claiming to be fasting for spiritual reasons. His sermons began incorporating subtle references to consumption and absorption of divine essence that made listeners uncomfortable without fully understanding why. More disturbing was Cranmer's growing obsession with the physical aspects of religious experience. He would examine people's hands and faces with clinical intensity, as if evaluating their potential spiritual value. Several courtiers reported feeling as though the Archbishop was mentally dissecting them during conversations, studying their bodies with an unsettling hunger. The secrecy required for these activities placed enormous strain on Cranmer's public role as a religious reformer. He was constantly balancing his need to maintain his reputation as a holy man, with his compulsion to continue practices that would have destroyed him if discovered. This tension contributed to the contradictions and inconsistencies that historians have noted in his theological positions. Cranmer's cannibalistic practices reached their peak during the reign of Edward VI, when Protestant reforms gave him unprecedented freedom to reshape English religious practice. He used this opportunity to incorporate subtle elements of his forbidden rituals into official church ceremonies, creating versions of communion that contained hidden meanings understood only by his inner circle. The most audacious example of this was Cranmer's revision of the communion service in the 1549 Book of Common Prayer. While appearing to be a straightforward Protestant reform, the new wording contained coded references to the consumption of human flesh that transformed the ceremony into a vehicle for his heretical beliefs. Thousands of English Christians unknowingly participated in rituals that had been contaminated by Cranmer's cannibalistic theology. But Cranmer's secret life began to unravel during the final years of Edward VI's reign. Several members of his inner circle had grown uncomfortable with the increasingly extreme nature of their rituals and began discussing the possibility of exposing the Archbishop's activities. The situation became critical when one participant, overcome by guilt, attempted to confess their crimes to a Catholic priest. The confessor, horrified by what he heard, immediately reported the matter to church authorities. However, the political implications of accusing the Archbishop of Canterbury of cannibalism were so enormous that the information was suppressed at the highest levels. Instead of pursuing formal charges, Catholic leaders decided to wait for a more opportune moment to use this devastating information against their Protestant enemies. That moment came with the accession of Mary I in 1553. The new Catholic queen was determined to restore England to papal authority and eliminate the Protestant reforms that had taken root during her predecessors' reigns. Cranmer, as the architect of those reforms, was an obvious target for persecution. But Mary's advisors possessed information that made their case against him far stronger than simple theological disagreement. The charges brought against Cranmer officially focused on his role in the English Reformation and his support for Protestant doctrine. However, the interrogators who questioned him in the Tower of London had access to detailed accounts of his cannibalistic rituals. They used this knowledge to break down his psychological defenses, confronting him with evidence of practices that he had believed were completely secret. Cranmer's response to these accusations revealed the depth of his delusion. Rather than expressing horror or remorse, he attempted to defend his practices, using the same theological arguments he had developed over years of ritual cannibalism. He claimed that his accusers simply didn't understand the true nature of Christian communion, and that his methods were actually more faithful to Christ's original teachings. The psychological torture of Cranmer's imprisonment was intensified by his captors' knowledge of his most shameful secrets. They would serve him meals while describing in detail the rituals they knew he had performed, turning every attempt to eat into a reminder of his forbidden appetites. This constant psychological pressure gradually wore down his resistance and contributed to his eventual recantations. When Thomas Cranmer was finally burned at the stake in 1556, he died carrying secrets that would have shocked even his executioners. His final moments were marked by the same contradictions that had defined his entire career, simultaneously expressing repentance for his Protestant beliefs, while never fully acknowledging the far more disturbing practices that had motivated his theological innovations. The evidence of Cranmer's cannibalistic activities was systematically destroyed by both Catholic and Protestant authorities, who recognized that revealing such information would damage the credibility of Christianity itself. Documents were burned, witnesses were silenced, and the few remaining accounts were sealed away in archives where they remained hidden for centuries. Modern historians who have gained access to these suppressed records face difficult questions about how to interpret Cranmer's legacy. His contributions to English religious reform were undeniably significant, but they were motivated by beliefs and practices that violated the most basic principles of human decency. The Book of Common Prayer, still used by millions of Anglicans worldwide, was created by a man who literally consumed human flesh as part of his spiritual practice. The buried truth about Thomas Cranmer serves as a disturbing reminder that even the most respected religious leaders can harbor darkness that would shock their followers. His story reveals how theological authority can be used to justify the most horrifying practices, and how the pursuit of spiritual power can lead to the complete abandonment of moral boundaries. Perhaps most troubling of all is the realization that Cranmer's influence on English Christianity extended far beyond his lifetime. The rituals and beliefs he developed continued to influence secret societies and occult groups for centuries after his death, creating underground traditions that perverted Christian doctrine in ways that their participants often didn't fully understand. Today, as we struggle with questions about religious authority and the potential for abuse within institutional Christianity, Cranmer's story reminds us that evil can wear the most respectable faces and speak with the most learned voices. The man who shaped Protestant England was also a monster who consumed human flesh in grotesque parodies of the very sacraments he claimed to reform. The investigation into Thomas Cranmer's hidden life forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of religious power and the dangers of unchecked authority. His cannibalistic practices weren't the result of madness or desperation. They were the calculated actions of an intelligent man who had convinced himself that his most depraved desires were actually expressions of divine will. The legacy of his crimes continues to cast shadows over English religious history, raising questions about how many other respected figures may have harbored similar secrets. In seeking to reform the Church, Cranmer created something far more disturbing than the corruption he claimed to be fighting against, a theology that justified the consumption of human flesh as a pathway to spiritual enlightenment.